Well,
Reverend
thank
Dr.
you.
David Fekete.
Thank you very much. I'm guessing most of you don't know much about Swedenborg because most of the world doesn't know anything about Swedenborg.
Not since university days.
Right. 18th century scientist who later thought that all his scientific work was meaningless because it didn't have any spiritual value. So he turned to theology in his 50s and wrote 30 volumes of theology. The Swedish Lutheran Church declared his writings heretical and forbade him to publish in Sweden. So he did most of his publishing in England. Interestingly enough, the Parliament of World Religions is coming up in about a week, I guess. And the very first Parliament of Religions was held in, I believe it was 1893, founded by a Swedenborgian.
Oh,
Charles Bonney was the executive director, and he was a Swedenborgian.
wrong this time.
Yes.
So we do have our influence on culture, although these days not so much. So we're going to take a trip today. I'll explain what that means in a little bit. So if you'll, I'm going to hand these out because if I just read these and expected you to listen, it wouldn't work. You need a few more over on that side?
No, we're good.
Well, does Ava have one back there? Now the poet William Blake, his life overlapped Swedenborg's life, and there are a couple of interesting things to say about both Blake and Swedenborg. Come in, have a seat.
Yeah, please.
Among the controversial statements that Swedenborg made was one that the last judgment, the final days, already happened. The thing is that it happened in the spiritual world.
Oh,
And there was a reordering of heaven and the institution of a new Christian church in heaven. And he not only said that, he pinned it down to 1757, which is when this new church happened. And coincidentally, William Blake was born in 1757, which is a fact that William Blake never forgot and took to heart to a certain degree. Blake had a love-hate relationship with Swedenborg's theology. He initially was very influenced and caught up in Swedenborg's theology in a positive way. Then, for some reason, we have theories about why, but we're not sure, he seemed to get antagonistic towards Swedenborg's theology. And then later on after that, still it's very clear that he returned to Swedenborg and was attracted once again by Swedenborg's theology. But whether he loved Swedenborg or hated Swedenborg, one thing we can say is he couldn't get away from him. He couldn't seem to get away. So much of his poetry is influenced by Swedenborg, either negatively or positively, but it's there. So what we're going to do today is look at a period in Blake's history when he was ambiguously involved with Swedenborg. And we'll see the ambiguity in what we look at. So let's look at this handout I've given you at the very beginning. Blake wrote an extended poem, you might call it a book, called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. The title probably derives from Swedenborg, because Swedenborg wrote a book called Heaven and Hell, in which he talks about heaven and hell. Blake wants to unify the opposing forces. So look at that first short paragraph. This poem was written in 1790. So Blake says, "As a new heaven is begun, and it is now 33 years since its advent, the eternal hell revives. And lo, Swedenborg is the angel sitting at the tomb. His writings are the linen clothes folded up. Now is the dominion of Edom and the return of Adam into paradise." See Isaiah 34 and 35 chapter. Okay. Now look at the new heaven is begun, Blake says. This poem was written in 1790, and I think a little arithmetic will say that that is 33 years after 1757. So Blake is referring to Swedenborg's new heaven that happened in 1757, and it is 33 years after that. Another English professor that I spoke to about this told me that traditional Christianity says Jesus lived 33 years. I don't know about this. Does that sound right to the rest?
They say 30 is
30 is what I thought. Yeah, not
up to 32.
up to 32. Yeah. So I think that other guy was wrong, and we're right about the Swedenborgian interpretation there. Now, what do we make of Swedenborg being the angel at the tomb and his writings are the linen clothes? Is that sarcasm? Because the imagery is quite positive in a way, isn't it? Does everybody know what that refers to, the angel at the tomb in the folded clothes?
Oh,
Resurrected.
The resurrect. When Jesus was resurrected, his disciples came to the tomb, found it empty, and there was an angel there who told them Christ wasn't here, he's risen, and Jesus' burial clothes were folded off to the side. So Swedenborg is that angel announcing the resurrection or the new church, and his writings, the 30 books of theology, are the folded clothes. What is Blake saying here? Is he mocking Swedenborg, or is he giving Swedenborg a strong image here by calling him the angel sitting at the tomb? How does that sit with you? How would you read that? Any thoughts?
well, it must be positive if he's announcing the resurrection. It must be positive.
It looks positive.
You
It
think
seems
it's
as if he's pointing a direction that here is something new starting.
It's an announcement. This is the announcer of a new idea.
Okay, yeah, I think we can take it that way also. I did look up Isaiah 34 and 35, and it's all about the destruction of the world and the creation of a new kingdom on earth. I didn't give you a citation there, but you can look it up if you feel so moved. So that all indicates that Blake was caught up in this idea that there is a new heaven and a new earth, and that it all happened, and Swedenborg is announcing it. Now, Blake doesn't like angels, and he does like devils. There's a line in this same poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he says, "I've always found angels to be extremely conceited, and that's because they only read the Bible in the angelic sense, and they haven't read the Bible in the infernal sense." But he isn't talking about the same angels and devils that we talk about. To him, angels represent reason and rationality, and to him, devils represent energy and passion. So he's sort of redefining his terms when he says these things. But he imitates Swedenborg's style in the several memorable fancies that he has scattered throughout the marriage of heaven and hell. And this is the trip that I want us to take today. Let's flip this page over and read Swedenborg's memorable relation first. Then we will see Blake's memorable fancy and how he emulates Swedenborg's style. Now, I don't necessarily need to read this out loud, but if somebody would volunteer to do the reading on my behalf, I think it'd be good if somebody would read this while we follow along. Can I get a volunteer?
Underneath the capital letter Swedenborg.
Yeah, the third memorable relation.
All right. Once, as I was meditating on the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet mentioned in the book of Revelation, an angelic spirit appeared to me and asked what I was meditating on. I said, the false prophet. The angelic spirit said, I will take you to the place where the spirits meant by the false prophet are. And he added, they are the same spirits portrayed in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation as the beast from the earth who had 2 horns like a lamb, but who spoke like a dragon. I followed the angelic spirit, and to my surprise, I saw a crowd with church leaders in the center of it. The leaders were teaching that nothing saves us except faith in Christ's merit, and that works are good things to do, but not for our salvation. They were also proclaiming that works need to be taught from the Word, so as to put lay people, especially simple ones, on a leash, so that they obey their civic leaders and feel compelled from within by religion to practice moral goodwill. Then one of them saw me and said, do you want to see our shrine? It has a sculpture in it that portrays our faith.
Keep going. Flip it over.
I went and saw it. It was magnificent. In the center of the shrine, there was a statue of a woman dressed in scarlet clothes. She had a gold coin in her right hand and a chain of pearls in her left. Both the statue and the shrine, however, were projected images. Hellish spirits have the ability to portray magnificent things using projected images. They do it by closing off the inner levels of our mind and opening only its outer levels. When I realized that the statue and the shrine were conjured up through sorcery, I prayed to the Lord. Suddenly, the inner levels of my mind were opened. Then, instead of a magnificent shrine, I saw a house that was full of cracks from the roof all the way to the foundation. Nothing in it was solidly connected. Instead of the woman, I saw a dummy hanging in the house that had the head of a dragon, the body of a leopard, the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. It was exactly like the beast from the sea described in Revelations 13:2. Instead of the floor, there was a swamp that contained thousands of frogs. I was told that under the swamp there was a great hewn stone, and beneath it the Word lay deeply hidden. Seeing this, I said to the sorcerer, "Is this your shrine?" "It is," the sorcerer said. Just then, though the sorcerer's inner sight opened up as well, the sorcerer saw the same things I was seeing and loudly shouted, "What is this? Where did this come from?" "It came from the light of heaven," I said, "which has disclosed the true quality of each form here, including the quality of your faith, which has been separated from spiritual goodwill." Immediately the east wind came up and blew away the shrine with the sculpture. It dried up the swamp and exposed the stone that had the Word lying underneath it. Then a warm, spring-like breeze blew in from heaven. To my surprise, I then saw a tent in the very place, a very simple one in its outer form. Angels who were with me said, "Look, it is Abraham's tent, just as it was when the three angels came to him to announce that Isaac was going to be born. And thought the tent looked simple to the eye, but as the light of heaven flows in, it becomes more and more magnificent. The angels were then granted the ability to open the heaven where spiritual angels live, the angels who have wisdom. In the light that flowed in from that heaven, the tent looked like the temple of Jerusalem. When I looked inside, I saw that the foundation stone under which the Word had been hidden was now covered in precious stones. From the precious stones, a kind of lightning was flashing across the walls that had reliefs of angel guardians on them, giving the angel guardians beautifully different colors. As I was feeling awestruck by these sights, the angel said, "You are about to see things that are even more miraculous." They were then granted the ability to open the third heaven where the angels live, the angels who have love. As a result of the blazing light that flowed in from that heaven, the entire temple disappeared. In its place I saw the Lord alone, standing on the foundation stone, which was the Word. He looked much the way he had when seen by John in Revelation chapter 1.
Quite a trip. Swedenborg's books have many of these visions in them. There's what you'll have in Swedenborg's books are sections of theology, very rational theology, surprisingly, given what we've just read. Then there will be a break, and one or two or three of these memorable relations will be interspersed. Then he'll go back and write more rationalistic theology, and then there will be more of these visionary, memorable relations. So his books are kind of you might think of them as a left brain, right brain alternating sequence with theology and then visions and then theology and visions and so on. Are there any questions or comments about the vision we just read so far? Because Blake's going to take us on an even wilder, I think,
Would you
vision
say
than
the visions were more like his internal thinking?
he
They
saw.
came from,
He claimed that his spiritual eyes were opened and he could see into the spiritual world. And these are things that he saw happening in the spiritual world. In the spiritual world, things aren't fixed like they are here, but according to a person's mood or feeling or what angels are present, the very physical things around you change and all have symbolic value to them. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I know there are many Christian mystics, and I'm not familiar with them, but is this sort of in line with other Christian mystic visions?
Well, yes and no. Other Christian mystics have visions, but they're usually, as I understand it, not this wild. And I get the feeling that some of the Christian mystics are half creating these visions consciously. Swedenborg claimed to see these things, and his actual creative faculties were not involved in the vision. I don't know, Don, would you have any thoughts about that?
No, because I don't pay much attention to visions.
Okay.
from so far what we've read, basically his visions and all are more on the Old Testament.
No,
You read
Revelation is
Revelation,
not.
Isaiah.
No, not Revelation. Isaiah, yeah, Revelation, no.
Okay. Not the Revelation.
Yeah, Revelation is a Christian book.
That's right.
Although the imagery here, the tent and the temple, are Old Testament or Hebrew scripture images.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what Blake does with this kind of thinking. Swedenborg called his vision a memorable relation. Blake created what he called a memorable fancy, which already gives you an idea how he stood in relation to Swedenborg's. Here, I've got more info. Do we have a volunteer to read Blake's memorable fancy? Ava, would you like to read that?
That's the Swedenborg,
Blake, back to the first page, the front page,
the very first page.
the very first page.
Okay, well, I'll have to get my glasses out.
Blake is here copying Swedenborg's style, but in this case, he's not claiming it's a vision. He's claiming that it's a work of poetic imagination.
Blake, the marriage of heaven and hell?
Yes, see where it says a memorable fancy?
Yes. An angel came to me and said, O pitiable, foolish young man, O horrible, O dreadful state, consider the hot burning dungeon thou art preparing for thyself to all eternity, to which thou art going in such career. I said, perhaps you will be willing to chew me up, me, my eternal and lot, and we will contemplate together upon it, and see whether your lot or mine is most desirable. So he took me through a stable and through a church, and down into the church vault, at the end of which was a mill. Through the mill we went, and came to a cave. Down the winding cavern we groped out tedious way till a void, boundless, as neither sky appeared beneath us, and we held by the roots of trees and hung over this immensity. But I said, if you please, we will commit ourselves to this void, and see whether providence is here also. If you will not, I will. But he answered, do not presume, the young man, but as we here remain, behold thy lot which will soon appear when the darkness passes away. So I remained with him, sitting in the twisted root of an oak. He was suspended in a fungus which hung with the head downward into the deep. By degrees we beheld the infinite abscess, fury as the smoke of burning city. Beneath us, at an immense distance, was the sun, black but shining. Round it were fiery tracks on which revolved vast spiders, crawling after their prey, which flew or rather swam in the infinite deep, in the most terrific shapes of animals, sprung from corruption, and the air was full of them, and seemed composed of them. These are devils, and are called powers of the air. I now asked my companion, which was my eternal lot, he said, between the black and white spiders. But now, from between the black and white spiders, a cloud and fire burst and rolled through the deep, blackening all beneath, so that neither deep grew black or a sea, and rolled with a terrible noise. Beneath us was nothing now to be seen but a black tempest, till the looking east between the clouds and the waves we saw a cataract of blood mixed with fire. Not many stones thrown from us appeared, and sunk again in the scaly fold a monstrous serpent. At last, to the east, distant about 3 degrees, appeared a fiery crest above the waves, slowly trailed like a ridge of golden rocks, till we discovered 2 globes of crimson fire, from which the sea fled away. In clouds of smoke, and now we saw it was the head of Leviathan. His forehead was divided into streaks of green and purple, like those on the tiger's forehead. Soon we saw his mouth and red gills hang just above the raging foam, tingling the black deep, and beams of blood advancing towards us with all fury of spiritual existence. My friend the angel climbed up from his station into the mill. I remained alone, and this appearance was no more. But I found myself sitting on a pleasant bank beside a river by moonlight, hearing a harper who sang to the harp, and his theme was, "The man who never alters opinion is like a standing water and feeds reptiles of the mind." But I rose and sought for the mill, and there found my angel, who, surprised, asked me how I escaped. I answered, "All that we saw was owing to your metaphysics. For when you ran away, I found myself on a bank by moonlight, hearing a harper. But now we have seen my eternal lot. Shall I show yours?" He laughed at my proposal, but by force suddenly caught him in my arms and flew westwardly through the night till we were elevated above the earth's shadow. When I flung myself with him directly into the body of the sun, here I clothed myself in white, and taking in my hand Swedenborg's volumes, sunk from the glorious climb and past all the planets, till we came to see. Here I said to rest, and then leaped into what between Saturn and the fixed stars. "Here," said I, "is your lot, in this space, a space it may be called." Soon we saw the stable and the church, and I took him to the altar and opened the Bible, and lo, it was a deep pit into which I descended, driving the angel before me. Soon we saw 7 houses of brick. One we entered in. It were a number of monkeys, baboons, and all of those species, chained by the middle, grinning and snatching at one another, but withheld by the shortness of their chains. However, I saw that they sometimes grew numerous, and then the weak were caught by the strong, and with a grinning aspect first coupled with, and then devoured by plucking of first one limb and then another, till the body was left helpless drunk. This, after grinning and kissing it with seeming fondness, they devoured too, and here and there I saw one savagely picking the flesh of his own tail. As the stench terribly annoyed us both, we went to the mill, and I in my hand brought the skeleton of a body, which in the mill was Aristotle and so the angel said, "Thy fantasy has imposed upon me, and thou ought to be ashamed." I answered, "We impose on one another, and it is but lost time to converse with you, whose works are only analytic." Was Blake ever in touch with Indian philosophy, the philosophy at that time in Europe, Italy and that side?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. There were travel accounts from India, and I know Swedenborg had one in his library, so it was available. When I find time, I'm going to get a hold of that volume and see how much Indian philosophy is in it. Why do you ask?
I ask this because from my own experience about the black gods in India, Kali they call the black, and there are these visions, you know,
Yes.
and stuff. And they also go to the philosophy at that time, which was supposed to be good. And they showed that there is evil in there as well, like, you know. And I think Christ himself said that even the devil can quote the Bible, you know, and we can fall. Even if some people go so much into one side, you know, too right or too left. And that is, I wonder if Blake got that idea from there.
Well, one thing I think is clear is that he's imitating Swedenborg's style in his memorable fancy. He's even imitating the title. He doesn't call it a memorable relation, he calls it a memorable fancy, but it's close to. And like Swedenborg, depending on the viewer, what you see changes. And in the Swedenborg memorable relation, if you were one of the evil spirits, the temple appeared beautiful to you, but if you were from a heavenly perspective, it looked shabby. So, like that, the person doing the seeing changes what you see according to your own feelings. And I think that's what Blake was trying to portray in this memorable fancy. Let's ask what he thought of Swedenborg in this fancy, because he mentioned Swedenborg's name.
Yes.
Where does Swedenborg come in Blake's memorable fancy? Did anybody notice that?
I did.
Well, I underlined it because I knew I wanted to talk about it. It's on the second page. He dives into the sun, and in the sun, he clothes himself in white and takes Swedenborg's volumes out while he's in the sun. Now, I think this is an ambiguous passage because, first of all, how does Blake feel about the angel? He doesn't like him very much, does he? And he's now showing the angel's spiritual lot. The angel showed Blake how Blake was going to end up. Blake says, okay, now I'm going to show you how you're going to end up. So he's heading in a bad direction already. But the sun is almost always a positive image. And in the sun, he's clothing himself in white, another positive image, and taking Swedenborg's volumes. He even calls it the glorious climb, glorious climate, a glorious place. So, even though he's now dragging the angel and showing him where he's going to end up, he's picking up Swedenborg's volumes from the sun, which to me is a positive image. Now, Saturn, he goes all the way to Saturn, and I think that Blake thought that Saturn was the end of the universe at his time. When I was speaking about this at a university in Ohio, a young child told me that Uranus had been discovered already. But whether Blake knew that or not, I don't know. Because in the next line he says, between Saturn and the fixed stars, as if Saturn's the end of the planets. And so I think that he's taking this guy to the end of the universe. He mentions Aristotle's analytics. That's once again, Blake was very opposed to rationality.
Oh, really?
Yes, he came right after the Age of Reason, right after Emanuel Kant. And Blake was all about passion and energy and emotion and love. And he's coming out of a society that had been built on rationality, reason, and science, the early times of science. So rationality almost always has a negative connotation in Blake. And so Aristotle's analytics are called a skeleton. And he also chides the angel by saying that the angel's works are only analytics. And I don't know what's going on with the monkeys and baboons.
Well, it's for the most
That's what I'm saying.
barbarism.
Yes.
The monkeys and baboons and all seem to be reflecting on the Eastern philosophy, because there are lots of monkeys and baboons around the temples over there.
Okay. Oh,
So
yeah.
that's why my friend, that there's some reflection there.
Yeah.
Pretty wild. But even his title, A Memorable Fancy, now fancy means, I don't know what it meant 300 years ago, but a fancy, like a flight of fancy, is something we deliberately think of. It's not a vision.
Right.
The answer to my question before. A fancy, maybe something fanciful, but it's still sort of a deliberate thought as opposed to an hallucination.
Mm-hmm.
It's more ephemeral than real.
Well, yeah, but by calling it a fancy sort of, to me, he's saying, I made this up. I deliberately made this up, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think he might be mocking Swedenborg too, and implying perhaps that Swedenborg's visions were fancies of Swedenborg's also. We have maybe 15 more minutes. We can look at another Blake poem from an earlier time period if you like, which was when he liked Swedenborg. That's on the next page. There's two poems there. The unfortunately titled Little Black Boy, but it is about a little black boy. This is a very Swedenborgian poem, written at a time when Blake was positively influenced by Swedenborg. So he says, "My mother bore me in the southern wild, and I am black, but oh, my soul is white. White as an angel is the English child, but I am black as if bereaved of light. My mother taught me underneath a tree, and sitting down before the heat of the day, she took me on her lap and kissed me, and pointing to the east, began to say, 'Look on the rising sun, there God does live, and gives his light and gives his heat away. And flowers and trees and beasts and men receive comfort in the morning joy and in the noonday.'" Let's pause for a minute in the middle of Blake's beautiful song. We're dealing with the East, which is where God lives. In Swedenborg's theology, this is pointed out very clearly, that the East is a symbol for God, but it's biblical also. When the glory of God enters the temple in Ezekiel's vision, it comes from the east. When the Israelites cross the Red Sea, it's an east wind that blows the water away and allows them to walk. So it's biblical, and it's pointed out in Swedenborg that the east is a symbol for God. Then look at the sun. Of course, it's self-evident, right? The sun gives light and heat as the two primary qualities. But for Swedenborg, light and heat stand for truth and good, or love and wisdom. The heat is a symbol of love, and light is a symbol of truth or wisdom. And so the symbolism there, God gives his light and heat. So that's an appropriation from Swedenborg. We'll move on to the next stanza. "And we're put on earth a little space, that we may learn to bear the beams of love. And these black bodies and this sunburnt face is but a cloud and like a shady grove. For when our souls have learned the heat to bear, the cloud will vanish, we will hear his voice saying, 'Come out from the grove, my love and care, and round my golden tent like lambs rejoice.'" Now in Swedenborg, you don't go to heaven like a place. You don't open a gate and walk into it the way you would at that door over there. Heaven is God's love and wisdom. The atmosphere of heaven is God's love and wisdom. And so the heat and the light in heaven are God's love and God's truth, wisdom. And if you have learned to live in love, you can stand the atmosphere there, because the atmosphere is love itself. So Blake says, we're put here that we may learn to bear the beams of love. If you haven't incorporated love into your life, it's too hot for you, you cringe, you leave, and you plunge yourself down where it's cold in hell. We use language like this all the time, don't we? When somebody turns their cold shoulder at you or gives you an icy look, we're not talking about love here, are we, when we use language like that? And we say somebody is a warm person when we're talking about loving people. So these symbols we use in our everyday language. And Swedenborg talks a lot in this symbolic language. And gold is a symbol in Swedenborg for heavenly love. And so they come to the golden tent like lambs. Lambs symbolize innocence. So we'll just finish off this poem. Thus did my mother say and kissed me, and thus I say to little English boy, when I from black and he from white cloud free, and round the tent of God like lambs we joy. I'll shade him from the heat till he can bear, to lean in joy upon our Father's knee. And then I'll stand and stroke his silver hair, and be like him, and he will then love me. This is from the Songs of Innocence and Experience. It's from the Songs of Innocence. And in the Songs of Innocence are all very positive, innocent, childlike poems. In the Songs of Experience are bitter, angry, sad poems about life. And there is a component, for every poem in the Songs of Innocence, there's a comparable poem in the Songs of Experience. This is a poem where the black boy is in a positive light. And often at the end of the Innocence poems, the last line is a kind of an ominous one. As we see here, he will then love me, implying what? Implying that he's not loved now.
So there was the usual discrimination about black or colored people in his mind as symbols.
Right,
Yes.
from his experience of living in England.
Yeah, there was slavery at that time.
Yes, of
Yes,
course.
it was, yeah.
Another 100 years.
William Blake was English,
Yes,
and Swedenborg was Swedish, but came to England.
exactly, yeah.
So normally, we talk about after death that the angel leads and all. He's put the angel completely out over here and put the relationship between the human being and God directly.
Pardon me, what was it?
Normally, if we read about afterlife,
Oh,
we
yeah.
talk about the angel leading and stuff like that.
Right,
But
right.
here he's taken the angel out, and it's the relationship between us and God direct. He's
Exactly,
talking about.
right.
There's no angel here.
No angel
No
here,
in
no.
between.
We're leaning on God's knees, like children. That's not unique to Swedenborg. The Protestants tried to get rid of all the saints and angels between a person and approach God directly. Priests, saints, and angels.
That
I
was the
like
Protestants
the
who
great
were-
reversal in the last verse.
Mm.
I will shade him from the heat till he can bear.
Yeah.
That's the black boy
I
talking.
know,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know, yeah, it's a great line.
And it shows how progressive Blake was in
Racial.
his outlook.
It's interesting when you talk about the Protestants wanting to get rid of the intermediary between man and God, where in Judaism you don't need an intermediary. So it's almost going back to the Old Testament's roots.
Oh, yeah.
Is that,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
that a fair interpretation of that?
The Protestants
I don't know.
thought they were going back to the earliest
Okay,
views of a person's relation to God, and yeah,
okay.
they
That's-
thought
that's
that the other accoutrements were human creations. I guess you could say man's creation because men were in charge of the church for the 2,000 years.
Man being a general term,
Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting.
Well, we have 10 minutes. Do you want to do another poem or call it? Okay.
Let's do another.
This, Karen, this is your your favorite poem. Last time I read this at the December gathering, you said it just mystifies you. So we'll get another crack at it here. The Divine Image. Again, showing Blake's progressive thinking. To mercy, pity, peace, and love, all pray in their distress. And to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God, our Father dear. And mercy, pity, peace, and love is man, his child and care. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress, prays to the human form divine, love, mercy, pity, peace. And all must love the human form in heathen, Turk, or Jew, where mercy, love, and pity dwell. There God is dwelling too. Now, my first reaction as a Swedenborgian reading this is that human form divine, because in Swedenborg, God is the primordial human form, and we are humans because we are formed in God's image. Swedenborg bases that on the Genesis creation story where God says, let us form a person in our own image. And so he makes man and woman in God's own image. If you'll flip over to the last page, there's a few, I've given you a few Swedenborg quotes that show the centrality of the divine human idea in Swedenborg. The Lord's divine human, which all things of heaven and the church look to as their one and only source. And then after that, it is from the Lord's divine human that heaven as a whole in part reflects a human. So God is human, and then the spiritual world, heaven, is as a human form, and heaven flows into our human form. So it's human, great human, particular human. So the humanity of God is absolutely central in Swedenborg's theology. And I think Blake might have been thinking about that when he talks about love as the human form divine. But not to give Swedenborg the only voice, I've pulled out a few passages from the Hebrew scriptures in which it talks about God as if God is a man, a person. We think about the first commandment. Is it the first that says no images? No images of God. And we think about the Hebrew God as being a power and a force, but not a person. But in Genesis 32, 24 through 32 is the famous story of Jacob wrestling with, it says in my translation here, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. There's a discussion about Jacob wanting the man to bless him, and then the man blesses him and says, your name is no longer Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men. And then at the very last verse there, Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. So he's naming the place Peniel because there he encountered God, and the presumption is that's who he was wrestling with. Then in Exodus 24, where the covenant is confirmed with the people of Israel, the elders of Israel, along with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, go up on the mountain. And it says in verse 10, they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone. So, and then the last line there, and he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. And finally, from Isaiah 6, which is a much later writing, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. And then I skipped a few verses, and Isaiah finally says, woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And Lord in all capital letters there is the tetragrammaton, the name of God. So he's claiming to have seen God, and God did not strike him dead. So even in the Hebrew scriptures, there is an idea of God as a human or as a man, although it's not in the forefront of Hebrew theology, I don't think.
Isn't it often interpreted that Jacob struggled with angels?
Yes,
Not
yes.
so much God, but struggles with the angels which were sent by God.
Yeah, and some people do say he struggled with the angel of God.
Right.
Because of that very reason, God can't possibly be a man that actually
Corporeal.
wrestles
Yeah,
with
it doesn't
Jacob.
come in, it doesn't have a corporeal form.
But then you have the name of the place in verse 30. I have seen God face to face. What do you make of that?
Well, yeah, I don't know.
Poetry.
Poetry, yeah,
Poetic
yeah, well,
hyperbole.
yeah, well, the word in Hebrew for face is panaim, so that's, and the L at the end stands for God, so
God's face.
God's face, yeah.
Do you think he's talking, as seeing God face to face, not as we see with our eyes, but with the inner eyes, seeing God within?
Well,
Getting that image of God as something very, and that would be a very real thing.
Of God having sent the angels,
Mhm.
that this was an angel from God. I don't know.
What-
Interesting to talk about.
what do you make of the Exodus passage where they beheld God and ate and drank? And you even have that line, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. With the understanding that if you see God, you'll be struck dead or something. But
Yeah,
here they're saying, it didn't happen to me.
yeah.
Like if Moses begged God to let him see his face, and God
Mhm.
said, no, it would kill you.
I'll show you the power.
Yeah.
God showed power, but not,
Mhm.
Yeah,
not face, yeah.
yeah.
Again, we are looking at all this in the English language.
Mhm.
This has all been translated. We go back to the original writings and in the original language does work, because so much is lost in translation.
Not
Which is
only
lost, we
that,
don't
there's
know.
redactors and copyists
Mhm.
and other people. I read a commentary on that Jacob story, and the commentator said the redactor put angel in there because he just couldn't conceive of Jacob actually wrestling with God. But if you think about people that lived 2000 BCE or 2500 BCE, their concept of God is going to be very different than a modern Neoplatonic view of God.
But I still think it's significant that in Hebrew, the sense of God is a presence and a force and a power. It's not God of physical shape, but the idols that they pronounced said all had a physical shape, like a woman. Often the woman was the god, and so
Or a golden calf.
or a golden
Yeah.
calf. That's right. So they were very physically oriented, but the true spirituality doesn't look upon God as a person
Right.
like us at all.
The Genesis passage, I'd like to think that it was a human being. The whole concept of wrestling, I think, is, on one level, it's a human beings wrestling. It could be wrestling with a concept too, that's
Mhm,
another
mhm.
thought. But there is something in that moment that transcends the humanity. And I think the last line is quite appropriate, not to be taken literally, but to be taken significantly, symbolically. This moment in time is divine. It has been a divine encounter. I don't know that I saw God face to face, but I saw God face to face, and that's my faith, that's my conviction.
Mhm.
I saw it in that historic moment.
In that
time,
encounter.
In that encounter, yes.
We do not.
Okay, just was curious.
Something homework.
Yeah.
Well, we're at time now. It's 1 o'clock according to my watch. and I hope you've enjoyed this trip.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Here, here.
Thank you.
Thank you.